Well, we're once again at 1 Peter chapter 2 in our 13th session of looking at this little letter, and we're going to finish out chapter 2 tonight. If you can turn to it, 1 Peter chapter 2, whatever Bible you've got, and I'm going to read where we left off last time was at verse 17, so we're going to read from verse 18 right through to the end of the chapter, and that'll see us really almost halfway, well actually just over halfway through this lovely little book. So let me begin reading at verse 18. You remember last time we were talking about that important word that sometimes isn't something that we like to practice in different ways. What was that word? Submission. That's right, submission. Well, you see in verse 13 it says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake, and that's really sums it all up. But in verse 18 it says, slaves. Remember, Peter was writing in the first century. Slaves, submit yourself to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if a man bears up under the pain of unjust suffering, because he is conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. It's quite a lot actually in those closing words of the second chapter. But I wonder, right at the start, I can ask you to think about something and ask yourself, can you say to yourself, as God's child, in any situation that you find yourself in, can you say, it's good for me to be here? I'm here by God's plan and purpose and design, and I'm here so that I can grow spiritually. Now let me just repeat those questions, those three questions. In any situation that you find yourself in, good, bad or indifferent, or good, bad and ugly, can you really say in your heart, in this situation that I'm in right now, it's good for me to be here. I'm here by God's design and plan and purpose, and I'm here so that I can grow spiritually. And I would have to say from experience, and I'm sure some of you would say this as well, that it's humbling to be around those believers who are going through or have gone through some difficult circumstances or deep waters, and yet their faith has carried them through whatever they were going through or suffering. It's a humbling experience. And I've known some people, godly men and women, who've been through some terrible, terrible experiences, and yet the light of God shone through their lives and their living as a testimony, even in the midst of what they had to deal with. And we all have, we all have those hard times, those discouraging times, and times when we're maybe anxious or filled with fear. But underneath, we need to remind ourselves that there's a bedrock of faith in God that will never be shaken if we recognize it, because he is our rock. And in a few weeks' time, there's a digger going into the site that we've bought for a wee house that we're going to build, and it's going to be putting down foundation, digging out foundation and putting in a foundation. And I'm hoping that it's going to be solid, that it's not going to slip or crack or move, and I'm sure it won't. It's good to know spiritually though that in our lives we have a bedrock of faith in God that we can depend on. But you know, the reality of life is that we do, you know, experience hard times. We experience suffering from time to time, and so I want to offer three perspectives, ways of looking at suffering that we need to keep in mind. Because first of all, sometimes we suffer, and I don't know if you've experienced this, I have, we suffer for no apparent reason. All of a sudden something happens in our lives that's not good. We have to go through deep waters, as it were, and there doesn't seem to be any reason. And you know, sometimes things happen to us that aren't connected to anything, or we can't understand if they're connected to anything, and so on. But because we live in a fallen world, a sinful world, bad things sometimes happen to people who don't seem to deserve it, you know. And we've probably said that, maybe looking on to somebody's life and what they're going through. They don't deserve that. They're good people. They don't deserve to be going through that. But that's life. That's life. And sometimes it happens to us. And we can't understand it, and we can't explain why things are the way they are. So sometimes we suffer for no apparent reason. And then sometimes we suffer, if we own up to it, because of mistakes that we've made. And from a justice perspective, the Apostle Peter would say it this way: if you did the crime, you have to do the time. We suffer because sometimes we bring it on ourselves, and there's no point in feeling sorry for yourself or complaining. If you did something that brought some kind of hardship on you, then you have to own up to it and realize that there's a consequence. There's always a consequence for things that we do. And then thirdly, sometimes we do suffer unjustly, and sometimes at the hands of other people. And what Peter has in mind in our text is just that, what he's talking about here. In other words, we might do things right, do things by the book, but we still get into trouble for one reason or another. And it seems unjust. And if we were to go back, and we haven't time to do this tonight, but if you went back to Acts chapters 3, 4 and 5, for example, in the book of Acts, we have a record there of an ongoing confrontation of the apostles by the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem. In chapter 3, you remember maybe Peter and John preached on the temple grounds and healed a lame beggar. They were doing good. And then in chapter 4, they were arrested. They were threatened, and they were released. They were let go. And then in chapter 5, you know, eventually after them being arrested for preaching about Jesus publicly, remember they were in prison again. An angel released them from prison, and they were commanded to not preach, continue to preach. And of course they were arrested again and been warned not to preach Christ. And Peter's reply was, we must obey God rather than man. And the apostles were beaten and released and started preaching Christ again. So Peter, who was part of that and who's writing this letter, he knew from his own experience that sometimes Christians suffer and go through hard times even when they've done nothing wrong. And you know, we look on at life and at other people's experiences, and we can see that sometimes, you know, as I said, we think about people, well, they don't deserve that, they didn't do anything wrong, that shouldn't have happened to them, but it did, and they're going through a difficult situation. And so Peter here really is spending a little bit of time, as I said, there's a lot in these verses, but he's spending a little bit of time to help us understand how we should respond to unjust, undeserved suffering when we think that we shouldn't have to go through this. How do we respond to that? And before we get into it, would anyone like to suggest what we should do if you know we're going through a tough time when we didn't deserve it. What way should we respond to unjust things that happen to us? I'm not talking about getting a speeding ticket. If you were speeding, you did the crime, you do the time. But when something is unjust and you didn't deserve it, or it shouldn't have come your way, but it did, what way should we respond as Christians?
Praise God in every circumstance.
That's one thing, yeah. In everything, give thanks with all prayer and supplication unto God in every circumstance. Yeah, that's one way.
In verse 9 in chapter 3 it says, do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult,
yeah,
but with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll come to that when we get that far, but that's another way. Well, first of all, Peter here, right at the very beginning of verse 18, he follows on from what he was saying in the previous few verses. He uses the word submit again. And he even exaggerates it to the point of saying you're to submit even to those who are harsh. He says, what good is it to submit only to those who are good and respectable and treat you favourably? There's no big deal in that. But when you're treated unjustly and harshly, and he's saying this in a very clear way, that we're to submit to those that are harsh and not just those who are kind to us. Now that's not something we would prefer to hear, but it's what the Word of God says we're to do. And the word harsh in the I don't know if it's the same in the King James, but in the NIV the word harsh is used. It comes from a Greek word from which we get the word scoliosis. You know what scoliosis is?
Mm-hmm.
What is it?
It's a twisting in the spine.
It's a curvature of the spine. Yeah, it's a curvature of the spine. And I think Peter's trying to tell us by the use of that word and its Greek definition that there are some people that are so morally twisted that they intentionally seem to brutalize everyone around them. And so on. And maybe you've met some people like that. There's just no pleasing them. And they'll turn on you for no reason. And they'll give you a hard time. And it's not that you've deserved it or you've done anything against them. It's just the way that they are. They're just twisted. And maybe you've called or maybe privately said, well, he's a twister or she's a twister. And yet Peter said that even in those cases, we're to submit. And then he goes on in the next couple of verses 19 and 20, and basically in these verses he's telling us that there's grace to help us do that. The grace of God to help us do that. It's not just, bearing up under this suffering and clenching your teeth or biting your lip, although we're to bear up under suffering anyway. And that in itself is praiseworthy, I suppose. It's commendable, like he says, but we're to bear up under unjust suffering, and that's grace. When you're able to do that, it's the grace of God that helps us to do that. In ourselves, we can't do that. And when we're able to do that and trust God in that, it's a powerful thing. When we're maybe threatened in some way or refuse to compromise our Christian values and our faith, it's the grace of God that helps us in that. When we suffer for what we believe and don't complain, like you were saying from chapter 3, that's the grace of God. When, maybe in your situation, maybe if you're in work or in some kind of situation, you're passed over, maybe for, I don't know, for a raise or for some kind of, you've been passed over and you think that wasn't deserved, that you deserved to, be heard like everybody else about something. That's the grace of God. When you're falsely accused And who here hasn't been falsely accused sometimes? And you don't retaliate, like Billy was saying there. That's the grace of God. Or you get ripped off. And you can still smile. Now, you might want to follow it up in some way if you can, through the law or a small claims court or something. But that's the grace of God that helps you to overcome that. Or, you know, many, many other things. And even when we continue to, you know, even through tears sometimes, still say, you know, Lord, I trust you, I love you. That's the grace of God that helps us to do that. And the reason that the grace of God can help us in that way is what he says in verse 19, at the end of verse 19. If a man bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because he is conscious of God, and that's going back to what I said at the start, being conscious of God, you know, and in that situation we say, it's good for me to be here. I'm here by God's design, and I'm here so that through this and out of this I can grow spiritually. And we have to grasp that and understand that if we're going to be able to do that. How can anyone submit to unfair treatment graciously? Well, how do we continue to, like you were saying, Bernie, to praise God, even when we or someone belonging to us is being mistreated, and yet we can still praise God? Well, we endure unjust suffering for one reason and one reason only, and that has to be because we are conscious of God's presence in it all. You know that old song, through it all, I've learned to trust in Jesus, through it all. In effect, we need to be able to say, I am where I am right now by God's appointment. This hasn't surprised God that this thing has come to me at this moment in time. If God wanted me to be in some other circumstance, then he would have me in some other circumstance. If God wanted me somewhere else, I would go somewhere else. Because God is good, therefore it must be good to be where I am right now. The fact that I can't see any good in it, in the present moment, doesn't mean that there's no good there. It just means I can't see it right now. And I might see it afterwards. I might see that, you know, and I've looked back sometimes in my life, and I'm sure you have too, and at the time you were going through something, or maybe not even something terrible, but circumstances of life, and I was only looking back that you could see God's hand was in it. But at the time, you weren't able to see that. And we need to understand that we don't need to understand the big picture of what's happening to us in order to believe that there is a big picture. God knows more than we know. And he sees the end from the beginning. And, you know, that God's promises cover every detail of my life, even when those details seem random, they seem out of control. God sometimes allows things to happen to me that seem unfair or harsh, and won't always understand them when I'm going through them. But the one thing I can do is endure them patiently, because I believe God is with me. He's the bedrock of my faith, and he's in every moment, no matter what it is. We have to come to that and understand that. I suppose in order to understand the right application of all that and what it means for us, I think we have to keep in mind Peter's original audience, the people he was writing to originally. And when he tells the slaves to submit, he doesn't mean, and I underline that, he doesn't mean that slavery is good and that it's wrong to seek your freedom. That's not what he's saying. Because as the gospel spread across the known world, you know, in those days, a lot of early converts were slaves. They were slaves. And they had no rights. Slaves had no rights at all. So, converted slaves who had come to Christ, they lived in this state of continual tension. Christ has set me free, but I'm a slave on earth. What shall I do? I'm a free man as far as Christ is concerned. The truth has set me free, but I'm still a slave. And that was especially emotional and poignant for a slave, any slave whose master was cruel or unreasonable. And in most cases, for slaves, freedom wasn't an option, and escape even was very difficult. And so the real question here, although it talks about slaves, it's not about slavery. It's about any unpleasant situation in life that you can't easily change. What do you do then? And it all depends, as I've been saying, on whether you're conscious of God's presence or not. Do you believe that God has you where you are for a purpose, even if you can't see what it is? If you answer yes, then you'll endure suffering, even though it might be painful or frustrating. But if you say, no, I don't believe that God has me here for a purpose, then you'll almost certainly try to bail out of the situation, and you'll probably eventually become bitter and angry in the process. And so it's important to understand what Peter's saying here. Slaves had no recourse. There was no labour unions. And the unions at the minute up north are really rampant. The teachers are going on strike. The nurses are going to have a ballot to see if they're going on strike. We had the council workers in Armagh and Craigavon and Banbridge on strike until recently, and there's been post office strikes. But the slaves had no labour unions. They had no advocates for them. They couldn't. There was no oversight, government oversight of whether they were being treated fairly or not. There was no, health and safety that been applied to their situation. There was no legal protections for them. There was no way for them to file civil lawsuits if they felt that they were being grieved. There was no one to solve those sort of disputes. So Peter's not addressing situations where you can protest or file a grievance or sue to change your circumstance, but the principle remains the same, because it touches the attitude of the heart. That's what it comes down to, the attitude of the heart, whether you're a slave or not. Do you believe that God is involved even in the worst moments of your life? Is he there in them or not? And I think I've shared this with you before, but I've proved that when my wife died very unexpectedly, within a matter of weeks, 9 months after we retired and came home from Canada, and looking forward to retirement and all that had for us with grandchildren and everything. But in that moment, in that bad thing that happened, really, I understood God had a purpose in it. Now, I don't fully understand what it is even yet, 6 years on, but I had a peace that was deep down in the bedrock of my spiritual being that allowed me to come through that, and not to get angry, not to get bitter, and all of that. And I think that's what Peter is trying to share with us and to tell us about all this. Because when we leave God out, when we're not conscious of God, like he says here, because he is conscious of God, when we forget God, then, life, a number of not so pleasant, even bad things will happen to us. When we leave God out, we will give in to despair, we'll begin to blame other people, we'll harbour ill will, we'll act hastily sometimes, we'll even maybe seek revenge, even though we're told, as Billy read to us, that we're not to do that. And yet, in our humanity, in our flesh, unless we keep a consciousness of God in the midst of it, that's what we'd be headed towards, and maybe worse. But when we endure mistreatment patiently and without resentment, the opposite is often true. We break the chain of violence. We set ourselves free on the inside. We demonstrate the power of Christ to keep us through it all. We prove our confidence in God's justice, and even in doing that, we'll baffle unbelievers looking on at our lives. How could they get through that? How could they do that? How did they manage that? You know, and so on. We're not angry with the world simply because we don't flourish in it or get on well in it. We're not unhappy that others have it easier than we do. We're not sullen and moody when we're mistreated. Why? Because we're conscious of God. And our suffering is not ultimately about us, it's about God. When hard times do come and we can feel mistreated, it's easy to come to some incorrect conclusions. We're tempted to say, God doesn't understand what I'm going through. God has forgotten me. God's not there. Why would this happen? But for God so loved the world, he didn't send an angel. For God so loved the world, he didn't send a justice committee to sort it out. For God so loved the world, he sent his only son. He sent his only... The Word became flesh, John says, and lived among us. And though he was God, he didn't try to hold on to his heavenly position. He made himself nothing. He took on, I'm really talking about Philippians here. He took on the form of a servant. He was born as a man. He traded heaven for a stable. Imagine that. The God of all creation, the eternal God, became a human embryo in Mary's womb. How amazing is that? He exchanged the trappings of being God to live in a mother's womb. He gave up the throne in favour of a feeding trough. We're going to celebrate all that at a couple of months' time when we come towards Christmas. And though he was rich, it says, for our sakes he became poor and humbled himself as no man has ever done. He endured mockery, hatred, ridicule, contempt, savagely beaten, then crowned with thorns, betrayed, tried unjustly, denied, crucified, died a humiliating death, was buried in a borrowed tomb. And there are so many other things, I suppose, we'll never know about what Jesus went through. And I think the most vivid, it's one thing to read that, but the most vivid thing for me to understand that was when I watched the movie The Passion of the Christ. Anyone else see that movie, The Passion of the Christ, that came out years ago? And it was in the original Aramaic language, and there were subtitles, but it portrayed the brutality. I've never come out of a cinema in silence amongst a crowd of people. Absolute silence at the end of it. And so as we think about the great question of suffering in the world, we don't know why some things happen to one person and not to another, and much less, I think, do we sometimes understand why things happen to us personally. But as the Beatles sang, it's a long and winding road that we tread, and there's many unexpected twists and turns, but this we do know: God is with us every step of the way. And so this consciousness of God, practicing the presence of God, as someone has authored, it is an important thing. And in the Christian life, there's only two ways to grow. One is through people, and the other is through pain. And it'd be hard to find a more important principle than this. Sometimes we grow through the influence of other people. We sit at the feet of teachers, friends, mentors, pastors, other gifted people who can show us the way forward and how to live as a Christian. And sometimes that growth comes in a formal classroom setting, maybe in a Bible study such as this. And of course we can learn a lot from reading books, Christian books and DVDs and all the rest of it. But we learn a lot more, I would say, from being simply in the university of life, as I would call it. And And the best kind of teaching is up close and personal. We can learn from a distance, but we learn more when we draw closer. But we learn the most when we're face to face with some of life's difficulties. And so we need to keep a teachable spirit as well as we go through life. Mark chapter 3 and verse 14 says that Jesus called the 12 apostles that they might be with him and that he might send them forth to preach. First they had to be with him, and then they had to be sent out, as they were, to preach. And so one way to grow is through people, but the other way to grow is through pain. And as I've said, sometimes pain simply comes because of life, because of the realities of life. You know, cancer, they just come from nowhere, or some other upset or even disaster can happen, or we might be called to share the pain of some loved one that's going through something, and that pain that befalls us simply because of life is often undeserved, and yet it comes to us anyway, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. Job, you might remember, said this in chapter 5 and verse 7, said, "Man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upwards." Life is going to hit us hard sometimes. That's just a reality, and it's something we have to get used to. And sometimes those sparks ignite into a raging flame or fire that will threaten to overwhelm us. None of us is exempt and gets a pass, you know. And often, I think it's true, people and pain go together. You've heard me saying, I think before, but you might have heard it yourself, you know, to live above with the saints I love, that'll be glory. But to live below with the saints I know, that's another story. Because people and pain sometimes come together. And that's, I think, the pain that's hardest to accept. On one level, we all understand that bad things sometimes happen in the world. You know, the wind might blow a tree down, and that tree might smash into our car, whether we're in it or not. We can't stop the wind from blowing, and we can't control, you know, the sea and the waves crashing into the shore, and some other natural disasters occur. Nothing we can do about them, or whatever. And it's hard to come to grips with all of that, but it seems much harder to accept the pain that other people inflict on us. That's the hardest, especially when that pain is deliberate, it's premeditated, and it's personally directed at us. And you know, you can't have come through life to where you've come to and not have had that sometimes come to you. And the list of things that can come that way is almost endless. Betrayal, being betrayed by someone. Jesus was betrayed in the house of his friends, it says. Lies, people lie about us. Accusations, people accuse us of things. Slander, gossip, fraud, deceit, unfair treatment, unfair punishment, humiliation, ridicule, sarcasm, rumours, the silent treatment, mockery, being called names, or being at the butt of jokes, and that sort of pain that is very common in the world in which we live is made much worse when it comes from someone who's supposedly a friend, or even a family member, or someone close to us. It's particularly hard to deal with. But bottom line is, and Peter's trying to wise us up to this fact, if we didn't already know, to be a Christian is to suffer. Now there's blessedness, there's joy, there's all sorts of good things about being a Christian, but being part and parcel of being a Christian is to suffer, and it's popular today to talk about how Jesus is the one who will solve all our problems, who'll improve our lives, and above all, he'll make us happy, and all of that. And sometimes the gospel is presented like it's a ticket to the good life. You know, when you become a Christian, your troubles are over. You know, and you and I know that's not true. That's a lie. It's true, yes, Jesus said, I've come that they might have life and have it abundantly, John chapter 10 verse 10. But that abundance and joy can't be separated from the truth that Christians will also suffer in one way or another. And those who are in persecuted countries, the Christians in those countries know that. And you've just raised money for some of those folks. And they know exactly what that's all about. And sometimes following Christ, you know, in these last verses 21 and 22, means suffering innocently. And at the end of verse 21 it says, you should follow in his steps. Follow in his steps. I read a true story in 1896. A Kansas newspaper man named Charles Sheldon, he wrote a novel with an unusual kind of premise. What would it be like, he said, if in every situation we asked ourselves, what would Jesus do? And he describes a year in the life of an American city where everyone in the city, everyone, doctors, lawyers, businessmen, salespeople, teachers, students, clergy, and so on, made that question the basis for all their decisions. And it became an instant bestseller. And although it's largely forgotten today, it led directly, many years later, to the WWJD bracelets. Do you know what those are?
Mm-hmm.
What are they?
What would Jesus do?
Exactly. What would Jesus do? But the original idea was, you know, over 100 years ago. This man that wrote that book. And so when we do have to face up to suffering of whatever form, little or large, we share in a tiny portion of what happened to Jesus. And following Jesus means that sometimes we suffer even when we've done nothing wrong. And the greatest honour for any Christian is to be like Jesus. There's a little song, you won't know it, it's a Salvation Army song that says, to be like Jesus, this hope possesses me. In every thought and deed, this is my aim, my creed, to be like Jesus, this hope possesses me. And that should be a hope that we possess as well, because whatever we have to go through in this life, it's nothing compared to what Jesus went through for each one of us. So it means suffering innocently. It means suffering patiently. Verse 23, when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. Suffering patiently is not a natural way to live. Now, some of us have a high tolerance of pain, and we can go through a lot, you know, whether it's toothache, like I have a little bit of it right now, I'm going to the dentist tomorrow, or anything else. Some people have a high threshold for pain, some people have a very low threshold for pain. English footballers are the worst. You know, you touch them and they fall down and roll around the ground as if they were being killed. But that's another thing. But when we're, you know, when we're insulted, for example, you know, our first inclination, maybe momentarily, is to return insult for insult. But Jesus chose another way, as Peter tells us here, when he stood before Pilate even, and Herod, when he was facing the mob, he uttered no insults, he made no threats. It says, as a sheep before her shearers is silent or dumb, so he opened not his mouth. That's Isaiah 53, of course. And you find out what you really believe when other people mistreat you. You'll find out how real your own faith is. And that's a good thing. And Peter's point is that this will happen to you and me one way or another, and that's a real test for our faith. And sometimes the real test of your faith is what you don't do. It's not what you do. We would think about that, you know, faith, works and all the rest of it. But sometimes it's what you don't do. Because sometimes you'd be a better Christian by not saying or doing anything in return, you know. There's a little verse that says there is, what is it? Well, of course, the Bible has a lot to say about the tongue and how powerful it is, and so we're to be very careful how we use it, even in returning or responding to something that's come against us. And there's a little poem that says, "There is a little public house that everyone should close, and that's the little public house just below your nose." It's good advice. And according to Peter here, in all that he's telling us about Christ, you know, he bore our sins in his body on the tree. The footprints of Jesus led directly to the cross. And he endured all that. How did he endure it? Well, the final phrase of verse 23 tells us, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. You know, these days we hear a lot of talk about claiming your rights, and even that spirit even infiltrates the church. But the Bible turns it upside down. You don't think of your rights first. You're to think of others first. And when you're mistreated or you're going through something, you should repeat, similar to what I said at the beginning, it's not about me, it's not about now, it's all about God, and it's all about eternity. And so following Christ means suffering innocently, suffering patiently, and suffering, in these last two verses, sacrificially. His suffering, Christ's suffering, was personal. It says he himself. And his suffering was substitutionary. He himself bore our sins. His suffering was severe in his body on the tree. His suffering was redemptive, that we might die to sin and live for righteousness. And his suffering was curative. By his wounds we have been healed. And our suffering, or his suffering rather, was reconciling. We were like sheep going astray, and now we've returned to the shepherd and overseer of our souls. It would have been easy for Peter, writing this letter in the first century, and particularly to slaves, to have said to his readers, follow Jesus and all's going to be okay. He'll make you happy, he'll make you rich. Follow him and you'll have an easy life. And there's plenty of TV speakers and preachers and pastors that are telling people that these days. And it's a lie from the pit of hell. It's a lie. And Peter, if Peter had said that, it wouldn't have been true. And it wouldn't have helped his readers in the first century, and it doesn't help us to believe that either. So what will happen if we do for others what Jesus did for us? What will happen? Well, maybe our not retaliating, our silence will convict them. Maybe it'll make them think. Or maybe if we show kindness, bless them, it'll disarm them. And when we resist the urge to get even, when we stop claiming our rights, when we give up our anger and bitterness, do you know what happens? We become like Jesus. We become like Jesus. And often the tongue is the last outpost in the battle between the flesh and the spirit. And even in the church, amongst church people, that's true as well. The tongue, it's a cutting device. It can be used for good, of course, but it can be used, when used wrongly, it can just cut people down. And Peter is telling us this. you know, that Jesus didn't open his mouth and all the rest of it. And it's ironic when you think about it, and it's amusingly ironic that this advice comes from Peter, who never seemed to have followed it himself as a disciple. He was a man with the foot-shaped mouth. He's always putting his foot in his mouth. And maybe that's why he's emphasizing it, because he learned the truth himself the hard way. And someone has written, nowhere is the power of the cross seen more effectively than when the righteous suffer, and in their suffering they rejoice instead of complaining or reacting. And that's so true. And you know, all this is not just, as we read it, it's not a rule to be kept. It's not a legalistic thing, but it's a miracle, actually, to be experienced by the grace of God to be received. Because we can never do it in the natural. Because apart from God, it's impossible for us to live that way. So we're to do what Jesus did when we're mistreated, when we suffer. We're to entrust ourselves to God, who is the righteous judge. And we're to experience the miracle and receive his grace. Don't return hurt for hurt. Take the miracle. Don't claim your rights, but receive the grace of God. And when we do that, we're really and truly doing what Jesus would do, and we'll astound the world around us, those people that know us and might expect us in the natural to act differently. And ultimately, out of doing that, God will get the glory. And so that's really what Peter was trying to tell his first century audience. But we're here today in the 2022. What do you think about all that, and about suffering and reacting and responding to tough times and hardships?